Hi guys, welcome back to Alamat, where we translate and narrate Philippine myths, urban legends, and horror stories to share to the world. For the fourth episode, we only have one story for you, but it's a long, haunting tale that I'm sure will make you feel creeped out. This story is called Years Ago in the Philippines by Shai Martian. I don't know what I had seen on that particular summer in the Philippines. Alright, before I jump into it, I'll give you a little bit of a background. My grandparents lived in a small village and owned a very old and very large wooden house. I remember staying at that house every summer when I was very little, and that the bugs were huge. The moths alone were as big as my face. The surrounding area was very lush and very green, and it was usually suffocating and hot and humid during the day. At night, I remember the house creaking and moaning with the wind. I don't think I ever thought that it was creepy back when I was a kid. My nanny, which is very common in the Philippines, would sleep in my room with me, so I never felt alone or helpless. I also had a rosary around my neck that my parents had given me when I was a baby. I often caressed it if I was feeling sad or scared. Anyway, there wasn't much to be afraid of. Crime was nearly non existent in that small community, and everyone knew each other. Of course, since it was the countryside, houses and neighbors were pretty far apart. Most houses were in view, but still, there wasn't any need to worry about things like that there. So, this is where I bring up the bridge. I can't talk about everything else without talking about that bridge first. There was a small and simple rust red bridge, maybe 20 feet long, over a little dried up stream. There was an overgrowth of weeds and plants surrounding the bridge, and you couldn't really see it until you were near it. The bridge led to a very thick forest, and I was absolutely forbidden to go through it, according to my nanny. Anyway, the other details of it are a little hazy, but I distinctly remember its red coloring. For some reason, its color was the subject of speculation by the other kids in the village. Father said the bridge was made of iron, but it rusted now, so it's not really safe to cross, Bayani, the son of the local rice farmer, said. No, no, said Mildred with wide, terrified eyes. My yaya, or a nanny in the Philippines, said it was made by a bruja, a witch, and it's made of children's blood to make it stronger. I looked at Mildred and said, I think your yaya told you that because you're such a brat and she wants to kill you, I said teasingly, and I swear that doesn't sound horrible in Filipino. But she still gave me a reproaching look. I laughed and turned to look at Lou, the quiet kid among us, and the bastard son of a rice cake peddler, which in the Philippines is the equivalent of a milkman in the United States. To my surprise, he spoke up. No, he said quietly. Mother said that it's a portal to the netherworld, so we should never cross it. We all stared at him, surprised he contributed to the conversation. Then Mildred piped up. What do you know? You don't even know your father. She screamed with laughter. Bayani hit her arm and she immediately started crying, even though we knew it didn't hurt her at all. We all rolled our eyes. When I heard Mayaya call out to me for dinner, I ran to her, and I remember that the rest of the day was spent thinking about what Lou said. Speculation about the bridge was usually about exactly just the bridge. But Lou insisted that it led to something sinister, which caught my rapt attention. It wasn't the bridge itself that we should have been concerned about, but it was where the bridge led. He and I would sit at the start of the bridge, fearful to cross it, not because of the possible danger, but because of what my yaya would have done to us if she ever found out we did. Look, Lou said one afternoon. Do you see that? He pointed into the thicket. What? I asked, squinting to see. There's a path, he said. I looked harder. There was a path, but it disappeared into the trees, and there was no way we could know where it led from just looking at it. One lazy and particularly hot afternoon, the four of us played hide and seek, and Lou was it. Lou almost immediately found me. I was sitting in the overgrowth of plants near the bridge, my back to it. I knew I would find you here, he said in a whisper. I laughed. Why are you whispering? I asked him, amused. It was then I noticed that he was looking past me. What are you looking at? I whispered anxiously. I suddenly felt the heavy weight of dread in my heart, and my throat felt like it was closing. He said nothing. His eyes were wide and unblinking, and the color drained from his tanned face. It was clear his gaze was affixed to something, and I dreaded to turn around to find out what it was. It felt like the heat was more intense, and the humidity soaked my dress in cold sweat. I slowly turned my head to look at the bridge, but before it came to view, Lou grabbed my arm and started running. He was taller than me and his legs longer, and I felt like I hardly touched the ground. Lou kept running and running until we saw Bayani and Mildred a few feet away. Suddenly, my foot caught on a rock and we tumbled. I absent-mindedly grabbed the rosary around my neck and accidentally tore it off in my tumble. I felt my left ankle snap as I landed on it wrongly. I dropped the rosary in my hand and I cried out in pain. What the heck are you guys doing? Bayani yelled as he and Mildred jogged towards us. At that point, I was overcome with pain and Lou kept apologizing. Mildred ran to my grandparents' house to call my nanny. That night, I found out I had broken my ankle after the doctor visited our house. I remember being disgusted by the man. He was the tallest man I'd ever seen, and also the palest. But he was very fat. I remember feeling his weight sinking the wooden floors near my bed as he examined my ankle. My hand went to my neck in search of the rosary, but I remembered I had lost it in my tumble that afternoon. My grandmother invited him to stay for dinner, and he obliged. The doctor sat at one end of our large mahogany dinner table. My grandfather sat on the other end. My grandmother, on the other hand, sat with my yaya next to her, and Lou and I sat next to each other. Lou was penitent all throughout the rest of the day and refused to go home. When my nanny called his mother, she wasn't home. Of course, he can stay with us, my grandmother said, after my nanny asked her. My grandmother was a very gracious and kind woman. My grandfather was not unkind, but he was sterner, with a loud and boisterous voice. So doctor, he said at dinner, you're new around here. What do you think of this place? My grandfather finished off the remaining mango juice in his glass, and my yaya filled it once more. The doctor was chewing his food when my grandfather asked, and I could hear the food sloshing around his mouth. His breathing was very loud, almost like he was snoring, but he was obviously awake. He swallowed loudly. It's very peaceful, the doctor replied, wiping the corners of his mouth, but missing the little bit of food on his chin entirely. It is very different from Manila, but I don't miss it. This is my home now. My grandfather liked the sound of that. I'm glad you feel that way, grandfather said. The nearest doctor is quite far from here. I am glad that we finally have one within the community. He made approving noises as he drank from his glass. Where do you live around here, doctor? Grandmother inquired. I didn't even know you had moved into our community until I asked Gloria next door if she had the doctor's number. She told me that she saw a man with a doctor's bag crossing the bridge the other day and that he was headed to Juan's house in the trees. I was surprised to hear someone had moved in without my knowing, she chuckled. Us old people are pretty nosy. The doctor smiled, his close-mouthed smile. Yes, well, my brother is very ill, he said. I came here from Manila just days ago to care for him. I haven't really had the time to introduce myself to everyone. I've been with him day and night, ensuring his fast recovery. He then asked my yaya for water, and she smiled politely. Juan used to have a ranch there, didn't he? My grandmother asked him, and he nodded. Yes, but not anymore. He has a few chickens now and a horse, but nothing more. Then he turned his head to me. Is your ankle feeling all right? He asked me. Something about the question had an ingenuine quality to me, but no one seemed to notice. But then I noticed Lou's eyes never left his plate. When I simply stared at him and didn't reply, my grandmother laughed. Hey little girl, the nice man asked you a question. I looked at her and then to him. His gaze made my skin crawl. I feel fine, thank you, I replied politely. Lou's arm gazed mine, and I felt his goosebumps. The doctor then smiled his unreadable smile. Good, he said. It should heal up nicely, but I wouldn't go around running with your friends anytime soon. Especially not by that infernal bridge, my grandfather added. A harbinger of tetanus and other dangers. The adults made the noise of agreement. After dinner, Lou and I were dismissed so that the adults could talk and smoke cigarettes. In Philippine culture, it's polite for children to take the adult's hand and press it on their foreheads, either in greeting or goodbye. Traditionally, it was a kiss on the hand, but that is considered old-fashioned. I, along with Lou, pressed my grandfather's hand to my forehead and kissed the top of our heads. And he kissed the top of our heads. I did the same for my grandmother, and she too kissed our heads. When I walked away after that, my grandfather clicked his tongue in disapproval. Come back here, he said. Why would you be so rude to our guest? I turned to limp back to the table and to the doctor. My grandfather apologized for me. When I reached the doctor, he held his hand out expectantly. I took his sausage-like fingers into my hand. I remember how cold and clammy they were. I pressed them to my forehead, smelling dinner on them. Lou timidly did the same. As I pulled away, the doctor gave us a small smile and whispered, "Thank you." Lou and I sat in my bedroom with my yaya, who was reading her magazine. Lou and I played some cards and said nearly nothing. When we heard the adults' conversation move outside, to the front of the house, we went to the window to look down. The doctor was saying his farewell, and we could hear grandmother and grandfather chuckling and thanking him. They chatted for a couple more minutes until the doctor said he really had to get back to his brother. When he was about to leave, he looked up at us and raised his hand and waved. Lou and I said nothing, and he laughed, and we watched him cross the bridge and disappear into the trees. That night, Lou and I laid awake in bed, the sheet up to our chins despite the hot weather. I waited for Yaya snoring before I nudged him. "Are you up?" I whispered. He slowly nodded his head. "Lou, what did you see at the bridge this afternoon?" I turned my head to look at him, only to find him with furrowed eyebrows and staring at the ceiling. Past the bridge, I saw the doctor. He whispered back, with a pale man slung across his shoulders. As he said those words, I felt my heart beating wildly against my chest. Then Lou added, "He saw us." "How's your ankle?" Bayani asked. My friends decided to hang out with me in my bedroom the next day. Mildred was looking at the clothes in my closet, and Lou was playing with my crutches. "It's really sore," I replied. "I can't really do much." "Hey, that's not true. Why don't you come outside with us?" "Okay. Why don't you come outside with us? We could catch some lizards," Bayani offered. Mildred snorted in disgust. "That's nasty," she said, and Bayani made a face. "I don't think I asked you, brat." He sneered. She threw a slipper at him, and he ducked. She breathed out heavily and plunked down at the edge of my bed. Everyone was really bored. Then Mildred had a suggestion. We should cross that bridge and see what's beyond it. The room was quiet. Lou rested my crutches against the wall. "I don't think that's a good idea," I said. "Even the adults never cross that bridge." "There is nothing there but poisonous plants and huge bugs," Mildred scoffed. "Everyone is boring here," she said. "Everyone in town is really old and boring. Why would they explore anything?" She paused and then added, "The doctor lives there." "So why disturb him? He is taking care of his brother, and the last thing he wants is children bothering him," I said, making an effort to hide my anxiety at her suggestion. Mildred, of course, picked it up immediately. "Why? Don't you like the doctor?" she asked. "I think it's a bad idea," Lou interrupted, before I could respond. I gave him a relieved look. It was then Bayani piped up. "I think it's not a bad idea. The doctor will not mind visitors. Anyway, we wouldn't stay there long. Just a visit." He looked out my window and to the bridge. "But that bridge is dangerous," I said desperately. Bayani laughed. "Okay, how about I ask my parents for permission? I know that they had tried to visit him one afternoon to give him a housewarming gift, but they said he wasn't home. I'm sure my parents would like it if I gave him the basket for them," he said. Before I could say anything to deter him, he said, "Come on, Mildred, let's go." And they left. After a few minutes, Lou and I watched Bayani and Mildred walking to the bridge. "Why would his parents let him even cross that bridge?" I said incredulously. Lou shrugged. "Everyone sees the doctor crossing it. I guess it's not as dangerous as everyone thought." We waited and waited for Bayani and Mildred to appear from the woods. In the first hour of waiting, I thought that things were going to be fine. And as my yaya often told me, I was just imagining things. After the third hour, and as the sun was slowly disappearing, I got worried. Lou had fallen asleep. Yaya would check up on me every now and then, and I would tell her I'm fine, and she would leave me alone. Eventually, I fell asleep too. Wake up, I heard Yaya say as I woke up to a hand gently shaking me. There she was, leaning over me, and she smiled and woke up Lou. What's happening? I asked confused. Lou stretched awake. Your friends are here, she said, and I heard Bayani and Mildred going up the stairs. I let out a sigh of relief. When they reached my room, Yaya left. Bayani and Mildred looked excited. His house is beautiful, Mildred said. It's enormous, Bayani said. The two of them were excitedly talking over each other, describing the doctor's house. When I asked if there was anything weird that they noticed, they immediately shook their heads. Then Mildred said, Well, there was one thing, she said. There was this really bad smell coming from the stairs towards the back of the house. As she said that, I felt a pit in my stomach. And I thought it was weird that he wouldn't let us see the backyard. But he said there was a lot of junk there and he needs to clean it up. Bayani added. Why did you want to see the backyard? Lou asked. Bayani shrugged. I wanted to see the animals, he said. And I remember Father telling me that the stream came from the mountain and near Mr. Wan's house. I wanted to see how far the stream reached. He shrugged again. Stupid, since the stream is dried up, Mildred snorted. I ignored her comment. Did you see his brother, Mr. Wan? I asked them. They shook their heads. He is sick, and the doctor said he needed his rest, Bayani said. Why would you want to see a sick man anyway? The house was so beautiful. We didn't really care, Mildred said. The rest of the conversation was about the grand piano in Mr. Wan's house, the tall ceilings, and the echo. The next day, it rained heavily. The rain in the Philippines can be such a heavy downpour, and the rain on that day was exactly that. The rain was so heavy, everything looked like a blur. The trees, the other houses. There was a blackout, and we had to use candles. I remember sitting at my bedroom window, just looking towards the bridge and the trees. But it was impossible to see. I don't know why I stared at it. I just felt like maybe the doctor would appear suddenly as a large demon, screaming towards our house and ready to eat me. Even then I knew that was a ridiculous imagining, but I couldn't look away. The rain stopped sometime in the middle of the night. I remember being awoken by a different sound from the crickets and the nighttime birds. I sat up in bed and listened carefully to distinguishing the sound. It was the sound of water, but not rain, more like a stream. I hobbled over to the window. What are you doing? Mayaya asked sleepily. She walked over to me to look what I was looking at. Oh my goodness, she exclaimed. There's water under the bridge again. The next day, people used the stream for everything. Drinking water, washing clothes, bathing. Then after a few days, the water seemed to turn rancid. And suddenly, the people who used the stream had gotten very sick. When someone's young child died, there was an uproar. We have to know what happened to this water, the child's mother said, and others agreed. Where is the doctor? Why has no one called him? Another cried. Among the din of outreach protests, Mildred spoke up. Bayani and I tried to visit him yesterday, but the ground was too muddy and slippery. From where we stood, it didn't seem like anyone was home anyway. But the other doctor is 2 hours away. We need the doctor. Everyone was yelling angrily and desperately until the barangay captain, the elected official of the community, spoke up. Let us go to Mr. Wan's house and see the doctor. Everyone shouted in agreement, and like a mob, they walked into the thicket. I couldn't go with them because of my injury, so this is how I remember Lou describing the events that followed. There was an awful smell of rot that started at about 20 feet of Mr. Wan's property. The ground was muddy and slippery from the rain, and it was a difficult hike that the older people stayed behind. But Lou, Bayani, and Mildred, my grandparents, and all the other people trekked on. He said as they approached the property, the smell was so acrid and rotten that he felt a sharp sting in his nostrils. At some point, Mildred went to stay behind with the old people. When they all reached Mr. Wan's door, they banged on it, but no answer came. They banged and banged on it, but again, no answer. Impatient and angry, they all went around the house to see the back. They saw the stream. It was almost a full river. It was running forcefully. But then they found the source of the terrible odor. There was what looked like a horse lying on its side in the stream. A tree had fallen, and it stopped the horse from going with the current. The horse was dead, but it wasn't the only source of the rancid smell. In the stream, dead chickens laid near the horse, just stewing in the water, rotting. Some people retched at the sight and smell of rot. Lou said that when he and grandfather and the barangay captain closed in on the horse, they immediately noticed something extremely odd and unsettling. The horse and the chickens and the few stray dogs that laid in the water, they were all dried up. They looked deflated and dry. Lou had a hard time explaining it. Another thing that they noticed was that all the dead animals had their throats slashed, but there was no sign of blood anywhere. Confused and outraged, Lou said my grandfather stormed to the back of the house and broke a window. He opened the door from the other side, and again, the rancid smell filled their nostrils. But this time, it seemed to come from upstairs. Lou and Bayani entered the house with my grandfather, and the barangay captain and a few other men. But they told the two children to stay at the foot of the stairs. The men went up, their footsteps echoing. Then the footsteps and shuffling stopped. It was silent for a moment. When the men started to come down the stairs again, the men said nothing. Only their shoes on the wooden stairs could be heard. What happened? What is it? Bayani asked excitedly. No one paid him any attention. Frustrated, he ran up the stairs. No, Bayani, Lou shouted, running after him. Lou said the smell was so bad it stung his eyes. There were several rooms in the upstairs, but only one door was open. And it happened to be the source of the smell. Bayani reached it first, and as he ran to the door, he stopped dead in his tracks. Then he started to vomit. When Lou came into the room, he described to me what he saw, with great difficulty. It was Mr. Wan, he said. He started to cry, and he wiped them angrily with a hand. Mr. Wan, his mouth was open, like screaming but with no sound, and he was so skinny, so skinny. His skin clung to his bones. He was so pale. And the maggots, flies. He cried fully then. He was the one the doctor was carrying on his shoulders that one time we were playing. It was like all the blood was gone from his body. His throat had a large cut on it. He sobbed. I comforted him, although I was terrified. Where was the doctor? I stammered, fearful of the answer. We couldn't find him. Everyone looked everywhere. He sniffled, then added, "That's not all." The barangay captain said that the cut on the throat looked like it was healed, then cut again, over and over, for weeks, until it was cut deep enough to kill him. After the incident, the police from outside the community came to investigate. They could find nothing. Only the fact that the animals in the stream had really been drained of blood, and so was Mr. Juan. There was no information about the doctor, and I remember the police finding it ridiculous that no one knew his name. "We simply called him Doctor," my grandmother once told them when she was questioned. "Nothing bad ever happens here, we never thought." The next day, my parents came to pick me up. Not much was said to me, and I remember saying goodbye to my friends. I didn't see much of them or the village again after that, and my grandparents visited us from then on. After some time, the whole incident was forgotten. And a year or so later, my grandmother told us that Mr. Juan's house had been burned down, and that the bridge was torn down. I suppose that's for the best, anyway. I hadn't thought about it for years and years until this morning. Sometimes, no matter how traumatizing something can be, life goes on regardless, and you forget about it. But even if you forget, it doesn't really mean it never happened. The thing that brought back all of it was in my apartment, thousands of miles away in Los Angeles. I found the rosary, the one I had torn off and lost all those years ago. It was resting against my pillow when I woke up this morning. What do you guys think about the story? What kind of monster would do something like that? If you have any ideas, put them down below. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like and subscribe and share this YouTube channel to your friends and family. That would help me a lot. Thank you guys, and see you in the next one.